Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
State Representative John Nygren of Marinette is a Republican seeking re-election in the 89th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. John, welcome back to WisconsinEye.
Good to see you, Steve.
At the Republican State Convention, you said this: we're going to have to start making tough decisions again. Is that a reference to the post-election reworking of the current fiscal budget, John?
It's possible. I mean, I think let's just be clear, we're in unique times. The COVID pandemic has shut down our economy for a number of months here in Wisconsin. Our tax collections are being affected by that. The next budget, or perhaps maybe a budget repair in the near future, we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions. The good news for people throughout Wisconsin is that, we are in a much better situation to weather this storm than we would have been about 8 years ago. I mean, when I first was assigned to join finance, that was the Act 10 era. That was a shortfall of about $3.6 billion. We had nothing in the rainy day fund. I've been lucky to be, co-chair during a period of time where we passed 4 budgets. We funded our priorities, increases in education funding every single time, more money for healthcare. We cut taxes, but we also were able to put money away. And because of that, we've got over $600 million in the rainy day fund. I guess if it's ever going to rain, this is probably a time.
Well, you and I are waiting for Bob Lang to estimate based on the tax filings, which were extended until this month, July. But do you think the governor could be right when he said, although it's months ago, that we could have a $2 billion general fund shortfall, John?
I guess I always try and be even more conservative, Steve. And initially, I was even more worried than $2 billion. I thought $2 billion would have been low. Yet, when you have seen the initial month, the filings, the initial month, I think we were almost $800 million short from the previous year. So at that point in time, I was all in on. First of all, I called on the governor, and I still do. I called on the governor. We should freeze all increases in funding in the second year of the budget to make sure that we deal with any shortfalls in the coming months. He said he was going to cut state agencies by 5%, and it ended up being about less than 2%, I believe, with most of it all coming from the UW system. So it is possible. I think it is possible we're gonna need a budget repair bill. But I'm far more optimistic in the months since April, May and June filing than I was at the beginning of this pandemic. And that's because I think some of those tough decisions we made in the past. Well,
you're not one to raise taxes or fees. So right. If you have to cut spending, where are you going to look in the current fiscal year?
Well, in the current fiscal year, it's very difficult. First of all, the governor has to trigger. He's the one that has the ability to trigger the budget repair bill. Yes. So we're kind of waiting on him. That's why we've actually called on him to make more aggressive decisions. Because when you look at the resources where we can make reductions, you have a maintenance of effort in Medicaid. The good news is the most recent report, we were, I think, about $80 million in savings. That's good, but long term, is it going to be there? I'm not so sure. Start looking at education as probably being one of the, obviously the biggest spend that we have. Yet we're now in a position where schools are getting ready to plan for the next year. That's where I believe we should have been having these discussions with the governor. The governor should have been having these discussions with his agencies earlier in this process rather than waiting until October or so when schools are back in.
Okay. When I did an exit interview with Senator Olson, John, he said, I really think in light of some revenue shortfall, we should reconsider expanding Medicaid. Is he the only Republican on JFC that is there?
Well, first of all, we're going to go back and get a reestimate on this, but that's always the argument where the Democrats go to right away, and I think it's they estimate $300 million. Yet you actually, if you start looking at the money that actually goes to the people that are covered through the exchange throughout the state, they are actually getting subsidies. There's an increased dollars that have flown to the hospitals and the providers. Let's be honest, Medicaid traditionally underfunds those providers, and because of that, there's an additional shift. But if you look at those dollars that have actually gone to the subsidies for the taxpayer to buy their own insurance, has actually gone towards increased Medicaid reimbursement rates. I actually think we're better off, or it's very, very close to not be in a situation where Medicaid is the answer for every financial situation that we find ourselves in. I'm always going to be a believer in the private healthcare system.
Well, we've seen the role that hospitals in Wisconsin and nationally have played fighting COVID-19. In the next budget, John, are hospitals going to have to be an even greater priority?
Well, first of all, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think every single budget I've worked on, we've increased funding for healthcare in Wisconsin. This last one, record amounts. I believe it was $150 million that went into healthcare. I think we doubled what Governor Evers had called for. So, it's been a priority in the past. It'll be a priority in the future. But all these things, Steve, are within our ability to pay. You said this earlier. I'm historically not a believer in raising taxes. Now's not the time, in my opinion, when the economy is where it is, record unemployment. We only get our resources from so many places. Going back to the taxpayers for more, now is not the time. So we're going to have to make those tough decisions and balance our budget, not with the whims of state government going back to the taxpayers for more. We're going to have to do that by reducing expenditures of the state of Wisconsin.
John, the debate over reapportionment, the governor wants a People's Commission to draw the lines and then forward it to the lawmakers. But the Constitution says the party in power. You see any need for a People's Commission?
This has been I believe this has been so politicized. Let's face it, it's a constitutional requirement of the legislature to do this job. If they don't like the job that we do, they have the ability to vote us out. And remember, when Republicans actually took the majority in both the Assembly and the Senate, Governor Walker got elected, it was under the old maps. So that just goes to show you, it isn't necessarily maps that put us in a majority. It's the will of the people. So I also think it comes down to we have better candidates. We do a better job getting our message out there. I'm also a believer in there's no such thing as a nonpartisan. Everybody's partisan in some way, shape, or form in this nonpartisan People's Commission he wants to appoint. Who's going to do the appointing is going to be, would be vital to whether you would say it or not. It's a nonpartisan commission. So I'm a believer in the current system.
John, the dozens of bills you've passed on the HOPE agenda continues to raise the issue of should we legalize medical and recreational marijuana?
So I evolved on this issue to a certain extent over the last few years. Let me just say this. Historically, when I meet with the addiction community, people that are actually involved with treatment, yes, they don't necessarily believe that we need another mind-altering drug at our availability in Wisconsin. Okay. And people oftentimes make the comparison with alcohol. Let's face it, that is already out of the barn, right? So having that conversation is not going to happen, making it alcohol legal. However, should we legalize or marijuana for recreational use? I don't believe we're ready for that. I am willing to have a conversation about for medical use in a very narrow way, prescribed by a doctor. I'm not for regulations per se, but I want to make sure that it is regulated to the extent that the THC content, that there is not a way for it to be distributed beyond the person who has the prescription for it. With opioids, that's one of the biggest problems has been diversion of those drugs. So I think there's a pathway where I can get to a yes on medical, and I had some of those conversations with Mary Felskowski and Pat Teston last session, and I'm willing to have those again next session.
Okay. We now know how a few cops treat people in custody. That led to the governor's 9-bill package, police reforms, ban chokeholds, uniform statewide standards to train police. Could you support any of those 9 bills?
So, Representative Ott had a bill actually I did vote for on statewide standards for training for police officers and for use of force. I know I've had conversations with local law enforcement, And what they tell me is, first of all, chokeholds are only used like in a deadly force situation where, their life is in jeopardy. And actually, they're not even trained on some of the things that we saw in Minneapolis, where the officer was kneeling on the George Floyd's neck. Those things aren't happening in Wisconsin. So, I think there is an avenue to look at reform, do the right thing, but I'm always hesitant to react to something immediately in our society. And oftentimes when we do that, we overreact. Or we do the wrong thing. So I would rather have, I supported Jim Ott's bill on the standards, but I would rather have a long, in-depth conversation with both sides of this argument, rather than just us politically doing something that makes us feel good, but doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Wisconsin's high property taxes is the reason that there's caps and limits on what school districts and local governments can enact. Those limits and caps can be exceeded with referendums. In the next budget, you're going to vote to keep those property tax caps and limits in place?
I'm a supporter of the levy limits, or the cap limits. It's one of the main reasons I actually ran for the office. First of all, was healthcare costs, as a background in health insurance, but also living where I live. Menominee, Michigan is right across the river from us. Historically, they've had about 30% lower property taxes than we do. So when people come to town, they always look across the river first. But we've done a good job over the last 8 years in reducing property taxes, or at the very least, actually keeping them flat. I think in 2018, property taxes on average were lower than they were in 2008. So that was a great success. Last budget, Governor Evers' proposed budget, I think it was the highest increase in 10 years. So we've had success. We still got to, make sure that we manage it appropriately. But I do believe that those controls have to remain in place. There still is a local control option here where the voters can exceed those limits. But from my perspective also, if it's a local decision, then those local financial impacts need to be felt as well. I think that's something that Republicans have, over the last few years, kind of get a little frustrated with the number of referendums that have passed, that if a referendum is going to pass in Marinette, should taxpayers in Madison pay for it partially, right? And is the reverse true? I think that local decisions need to be felt locally as much as possible.
With local governments so reliant on the property tax, John, do they need alternative revenue sources? Remember Milwaukee lobbying for the ability to adopt an additional half-cent sales tax? Is it time to look at new revenue sources for local governments?
First of all, remember they were looking for that half cent for funding for the police. Interesting timing of that now, where they're having conversations about defunding the police in Milwaukee and other places throughout the state. I am a believer in more of a consumption-driven tax system. The person who consumes the most, who spends the most, should pay the most. Yet, having said that, so I'm willing to have conversations about, John Mocco has done a lot of research on this, and he and I have had conversations over that. I'm willing to have a conversation about what should be taxed, what shouldn't be taxed from a sales tax standpoint. But at the end of the day, I believe that we should look for a system that is fairer, spreads it out more. But I'm not looking for whole-scale tax increases to be, at the end of the day. I don't look at that as a way to put a lot more money into the coffers. I look at more as a fairness conversation.
We still don't have a long-term to pay for our highways. The governor recommended a gas tax increase. Are you any closer to supporting an increase in our 30.9-cent gas tax?
Well, I was a supporter of the gas tax increase under Governor Walker because it was based on the needs that were out there, right? We did just raise our title fee significantly, and that was meant to replace that gas tax increase. So, I guess now if there's an additional need, they're going to have to make that case with me, because that was the reason that we did what we did with the title fee, was to get more resources into the transportation system. Once again, in a time where the economy is where it is, taxpayers throughout the state are suffering. Unemployment was as high as 14%. I think it's down to 12 now. This is not a time to be all excited about bringing additional tax dollars into Wisconsin. We need to be looking at ways to balance our budget within the dollars that people are already giving us.
follow up on the pandemic, John. Should businesses that follow all the rules and all the rules and recommendations of the CDC, WEDC on COVID, should they be immune from frivolous lawsuits?
I think the key word there, Steve, is frivolous. So I agree. I believe they should be held immune from frivolous lawsuits if they are found to be, if there's liability that they made mistakes, they did things wrong, and there were people that got sick or worse, life was lost based on those decisions, and that's a different conversation. But frivolous, definitely, I think they should be protected.
Another issue that you've heard a lot about is when a local government wants to authorize a public works project, the old question whether they should have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses. The study that found in 2015, out-of-state contractors got $72 million in public works projects. That more than doubled to $146 million in 2018. Should local governments have to give preferences to Wisconsin businesses?
Well, first of all, I mean, it'd be hard pressed to put into place anything that says it has to be, certain preferences. But if all things are equal, equal training, equal expertise, equal cost, my goal would, working with local governments would always be to employ local people as much as possible. So, and I would assume that people, when they're making decisions about those projects, would want the same. So, I think we should always err on the side of employing people in Wisconsin as long as all those other factors are met.
John, let's talk about the main claim of your opponent, who I've already had a chance to interview. She really says that you've let down your community in getting tough on PFAS. She said you could have and should have fought for a tougher bill, the one that the Assembly sent the Senate, which the Senate didn't act on. I want to give you a chance to respond to her claims, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, you've been around long enough, Steve, as have I. I wasn't around for PCBs or some of the other environmental issues that the state has faced over time. But these are not things that are handled quickly and, or should be, because they're very complicated. I think PCBs, the most recent news was they've finally, after 40 years, they've said that the Fox River is cleaned up. So to be able to say that in one session, because 2 years ago is when we were first finding out about PFAS in Marinette, and there's very few sites throughout the state that are even mentioned beyond the level of Marinette. We're one of the hotspots in the nation, according to the experts. To be able to say in one session that you're going to be able to get everything accomplished, I think is overly optimistic. As a matter of fact, if you actually look the National Association of Environmental Legislators, I think if you track, they have a bill tracker. I've actually proposed and even passed in a couple cases more legislation than any other legislator in the nation on PFAS. But as I told some of my constituents here, first of all, there was a CLEAR Act proposed by Senator Hansen, Senator Miller. That bill was dead on arrival. So I spent months looking for a pathway to find something that could pass. Now, we not only got it introduced, we got it through committee in both houses. It did not make it to the floor for a vote. But being able to withstand the pressures from industry and others, there was a paper mill that testified on the bill that I did have that said, out of Tomahawk, that said the bill that we were proposing would have cost $100 million up to $100 million for them, and likely they would have shut their doors rather than comply. When you start having conversations like that throughout the state and they don't have the PFAS issue like we do, it's very difficult to be able to just say to them, we're going to pass this bill. I don't care if you're the speaker, the majority leader, or the co-chair. We need more education of my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, to be able to get long-term comprehensive bills that will deal with this PFAS. While it's a Marinette issue now, I believe it will be more prevalent in other districts throughout the state. But I asked my local water advocates, you need to help me get that word out to other colleagues throughout the state, because as of right now, even today, they're not there. Now, we're farther along. We got a bill proposed, a bill through committee. We're farther along than we were. I take that as a victory, and especially when you consider even the last day, we've made an amendment on a bill to get clean water to people that are already affected. We provide more resources for the DNR. For my opponent, that's not enough. Well, you know what? I'm never going to, if we have an opportunity to move the ball 10 yards, we're going to move the ball 10 yards because that's better than where we are today.
Okay, then if you're reelected, then your next priority on PFAS is to widen the circle of knowledge about the threat that they pose to safety, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I think it needs to be more than just a Marinette issue for it to be successful. I mean, the long-term goal is regulations and standards. I have actually pushed the DNR to implement standards. They're in the process of writing those emergency rules. That's where the water advocates get frustrated. Is it takes up to 3 years to write those rules in place, and I understand that frustration. But you're also, they don't want to have to wait for legislative oversight, for public comment. Those are things that are very difficult to do away with. I mean, in what situations does the legislature willingly give away public, their oversight over a bill? In what situations the public willingly give up their input? So those are things we have to overcome. But we're a couple of years in now, and I think by the end of this next session, we'll be farther along even still.
Just a final question: you want to highlight any other differences with you and your opponent on August 11th?
Sure. Primary. First of all, hey, I respect anybody that's got passion. She definitely has a passion for the water issues. I would point out I am the only person, not only in the primary, but in the general election, that actually lives in the affected area and am actually on a well. So not only is this affecting my constituents, it's affecting my family. She's passionate, but besides the water issue, she readily admits that she supported Bernie Sanders twice. Most recently in April. So if you look at, she supports universal health care. She supports, the Green New Deal. She supports, she believes we should still be shut down as a state. So, I mean, she's got a lot of positions that are not consistent with Republicans. The good news is my constituents over the years, I think I built up a pretty good reputation of being able to get things done for this area. And I think I still have that trust factor built in with them. So I think she's got some passion that needs to be channeled, but she probably should be running on the other ticket.
State Representative John Nygren of Marinette is a Republican seeking re-election in the 89th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. John, thank you so much for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks, Steve. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you, sir.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.